This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. This is part 2 of the series that I have entitled What We Believe, and we are talking about the phrase in Paul's definition of the gospel, according to Scripture. So what does that term mean? Again, for those of you guys that didn't catch the first episode, it was released 2 Thursdays ago. This is a 7-part series that I'm doing every other week. I'm going to be releasing an episode of this, and this is based on a set of videos that I did, I guess 5 years ago at this point. I was asked to be the interim youth director at my church, and it was right in the middle of the pandemic. So we had to do all of our meetings online. And so I went over some of the basics of the Christian faith. So I started week 1 with the gospel, and then we're breaking down the components of the gospel as Paul articulates it in the first five verses of Paul's letter to the Romans. So this one is what Paul means by the phrase according to Scripture. And I hope that you guys really enjoy it. A nice short introduction to a very rich biblical topic. As I said before, my opinion on some of these issues has changed a little bit, and on some of them, it hasn't changed that much. So I hope that you guys enjoy this. I hope it's enlightening to you. Let me know what you think. Thank you guys so much for all your love and support. And I hope that you enjoy this episode. Here we go. Hey, everybody. Welcome to week 2 of our series, What Do We Believe? Again, this is Ignite Student Ministries, and since we are all under quarantine with the coronavirus right now, instead of meeting on Sunday nights, we are doing our devotionals in this video series. So for the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about what it is that we believe as Christians. And last week, we took a look at the gospel. So in Romans chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, the Apostle Paul, who is the guy that wrote Romans, outlines all of the things that he taught about Jesus and all of the beliefs of the early church. And he calls that the gospel. So when we use that term gospel, we're talking about the things as Christians that we believe to be true about Jesus. These are like the basics of our faith. And we learned 3 things last week. That number 1, gospel means good news. Number 2, that term gospel comes from the Old Testament, and it's the good news of how God rescues his people. And then number 3, the Romans also use that term gospel to refer to the Roman emperor and to refer to Roman rule. And so when Paul and other early Christians use that term gospel, they're trying to say basically that Jesus is more powerful than the Roman Empire. So that's what they mean. That's what Paul means in particular by the term good news. And he explains what that good news or that gospel means in Romans 1 through 5. Just remember that I use the term gospel and good news interchangeably because that's what that word gospel literally means. It just means good news. So we know that in Romans 1 through 5, and you can read that, we read it last week on the video devotional, we know that there is the place that Paul explains what that good news is all about. What are the things that people believe? So once Paul says that he's going to explain the gospel, he has to break down exactly what it means. So here's what Paul says in Romans chapter 1 through 2, or in Romans chapter 1, verse 2, rather, and this is the very first thing that he says about his gospel, that his gospel was promised beforehand through the prophets of God in the Holy Scriptures. So for Paul, he's saying that his good news about Jesus, according to Romans chapter 1, verse 2, was promised beforehand in the Holy Scriptures. Now, for Paul, the Scriptures are our Old Testament today. Remember that Paul is one of the writers of the New Testament, and so he didn't think about the New Testament when he was writing because it didn't exist. So when Paul says that this message about Jesus is according to Scripture, what he means is that it's according to the Old Testament, that somehow the story of the Old Testament points to Jesus. And when Paul says that, he doesn't just mean that you can go back to the Old Testament and find a passage here or a passage there. that refers to Jesus and the coming of Christ. What Paul is saying is that the entire Old Testament, the whole story, all the way from Genesis to Malachi, points towards Jesus. And so the gospel, or the good news about Jesus, is the conclusion of, or the fulfillment of, the story of the Old Testament. The entire story finds its fulfillment, or its closing scene in Jesus. So for Paul, his entire world is shaped by the Old Testament. Like when Paul thinks about the world around him, when he thinks about Jesus and the Roman Empire and the church, he thinks about all of that based on his understanding of the Old Testament, that story that he believes is fulfilled and completed in Jesus. So if you remember last week, we talked about a scholar named James Dunn, and I told you he's one of my favorite scholars in the world. He has a term for this, and he calls the Old Testament Paul's narrative substructure, which is a very fancy term that basically means that Paul thinks about Jesus in terms of the entire story of the Old Testament, not just one or two specific verses. So what is that Old Testament story? So basically for Paul, the idea of the Old Testament story is that in Genesis 1 and 2, God creates a really good world, and he gives human beings the responsibility of ruling over that world. And then in Genesis 3 through 11, human beings decide that they're going to reject that responsibility, do their own thing, and then sin and death enter the world, and the world gets progressively worse and worse. And then in Genesis chapter 12, there's a man named Abraham that comes along, and God sees that Abraham's like the only person who wants to be faithful and follow God. So he calls Abraham and promises him a family named Israel. And through the family of Abraham, through Israel, God is going to restore the world to the good place that it was in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. And the big picture, the big story of the Old Testament is that Israel fails, that they don't live up to the calling that God has given them, that they don't live up to the calling to be the people that are obedient to God. So at the very end of our Old Testament, we have this section called the prophets, and the prophets are people like Isaiah, like Jeremiah, like Ezekiel, like Malachi, and they look back at Israel's failure and about the calling of God, and they look forward to a time when God is going to come back and rescue his people. And if you remember from last week, it's from the book of Isaiah, from the prophet Isaiah, that we get that term good news. That good news is when God comes back and rescues the world that he created. He rescues all of his people that have messed up and that have sinned and that has failed. And so when Paul says that Jesus and Jesus' death and resurrection, which we're going to take a look at in a couple of weeks, that with Jesus' life and death and resurrection, the story of the Old Testament of creation being flawed, of humans failing to be obedient to God, all of that meets its conclusion in Jesus. And the prophets kind of looked forward to that day. They said God's going to have to find a way to bring all this to its conclusion, and Jesus is the way that God chooses to do that. So God's purposes for the world and for his people Israel are fulfilled in Jesus. And we're going to take a look over the next couple of weeks as to how exactly that happens. But for Paul, it's very important to remember that when Paul thinks about the good news, the message of Jesus, that Paul thinks about that as the fulfillment of the entire story of the Old Testament, that the Old Testament reaches its conclusion in Jesus. Okay, so that being said, I have two questions that I want you to think about this week. Question number one, why is it important that Jesus is at the center of God's story? And how does this change the way that we think about Jesus? So in other words, why is it important that Jesus is the one that we should devote our entire lives to? And how does knowing that Jesus fulfills the Old Testament story change the way that we think about him? And then number two, how or why or is it important for you to understand the Old Testament? So as Christians today, there's kind of this popular belief that the Old Testament was kind of like plan A and the New Testament is plan B, and so we don't really need the Old Testament. But if Paul says that Jesus is the fulfillment of that story, how important is it for us to understand the Old Testament? And if you don't think it's important, I'd love to know why, so we can have that conversation. So is the Old Testament important for you? Why or why not? And we can be honest with that. That's all I got for you this week. A couple of announcements before we wrap up. Number one, back in October, I actually taught a class at Generations on the Old Testament, and if you want to check, I had a website for that. It's got a different section in the website for each of the parts of the Old Testament and some good introductions, videos, things like that. If you want to learn more about the Old Testament story, you can check that out at sites.google.com/view/GENUOT, and I'll put the link to that in the video. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.